Hi, my name is Dr. Rob Kirkland, the Associate Director of Graduate Education here at CSU Global. Aaron Appelwick and I will be talking today about corruption, drug trafficking, and violence in Mexico. And I know most of you on here are students in the Criminal Justice Management Program here at CSU Global and may have some experience with counter drug operations or at your local agency in combating drugs on the streets. And I think you'll find this presentation to be helpful in understanding why Mexico has such a difficult time controlling drug traffickers in Mexico. It really stems from the issues of corruption that are endemic in Mexico and have been as sort of a historical norm in that country. So before we get started, let me just go ahead and give you a background on Aaron and myself. Both Aaron and I are veterans. Aaron retired after 12 years in the Air Force. I've had 26 years in the Army, but Aaron was an Air Force guy. He served as a security forces member, spent 5 years providing law enforcement and physical security at Grand Forks Air Force Base, North Dakota. Worked in the Air Force Europe's Contingency Response Group in Germany, did tactical nuclear response in Montana, was involved with special operations, medical first responder, airborne air assault operations, nuclear disaster response, and medical first responder. He currently resides with his wife and 4 children in the beautiful Pacific Northwest and is about ready to graduate with a bachelor's degree in criminal justice and law enforcement administration after this term here at Global. As for myself, I'm a 26-year Army retired officer. I was a Latin American Foreign Area Officer. Got a master's and PhD in Latin American history from University of Pittsburgh, and then taught at the Military Academy Latin American history and served as an analyst looking at issues particularly of drug trafficking and gang violence. Later on in my career, I was a professor of military science, Army ROTC at the University of Southern California, Trojan Battalion. And then after I retired in 2013, I've been teaching here at Global, really kind of concentrating more on the areas of drug cartel and gang violence. I have a book out. We're going to have a second edition of that book in 2018, which Aaron and I wrote a portion of the book on gang violence, not on drug cartels, but we looked at that issue. So this is an example of kind of professor and student involvement in publishing. And I also serve as a expert witness for Central American and Mexican officers who, or rather Central American and Mexican nationals who feel threatened by both the drug cartels and the gangs. And I do testimony on their behalf, kind of laying out the issues with the situation and the violence in both Central America and Mexico. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. And please just hold your questions till the end, and Aaron and I will be more than happy to talk to you and answer any questions you may have here. So we'll move on to the next slide here. Really what you're looking at here is a corruption and drug trafficking criminal organization. We would call it as drug trafficking organizations, or DTOs, really can't function without corruption. And corruption and organized crime are really inherently linked. If you take a look back at U.S. history, if you take a look at the bootleggers during the Depression era, oftentimes local police forces were co-opted by these, by the bootleggers and by the people, by the mob, by the mafia. Today, we see things like prostitution rings and gambling in major U.S. cities, where the money that flows through these areas has then co-opted the local police, law enforcement to kind of turn a blind eye towards some of the things going on. And so, it's not just corruption, but in fact, what you see when the corruption is endemic is that the law enforcement itself then becomes co-opted and actually continues and actually furthers the issues with corruption and furthers the issues with the crime in their areas. And so Laurie Friedman had a very good quote that says doing business in Mexico entails bribing and intimidating public officials and law enforcement and judicial agents. Organized crime cannot survive without corruption. So what we're going to do here is then take a look at how bad this corruption is in Mexico to kind of give you an idea of what we're looking at here. Really, corruption in Mexico has gone back, really goes back a long way. As you know, many third world countries suffer from corruption. As a matter of fact, corruption is something that is in part of the society and is considered to be something that is mutually acceptable by the patron, who is the person who has power, as well as the person who wants something. And so in Latin America has had an issue with corruption. Some of it has to do with simply the history of Latin America with the Spanish and the issues involved with having corruption be somewhat considered to be normal mode of operations in these countries. So you have a situation then where corruption is somewhat accepted in these countries, but then added on top of that is just simply the amount of money that's going through places like Central America and Mexico, drug money, and has created a toxic effect on all of these individuals that you see that are involved with stopping drugs. For example, in the ports, you have port officials that are bribed. So you have drugs coming into the port and the port officials are bribed and let the drugs go by. Prisoner officials who allow drug kingpins to escape or petty offenders to escape, or allow drug kingpins to continue to operate and control within prisons. Local military and police commanders, governors, governor candidates, state police, investigators, district attorneys, mayors, judges, you name it, have been under the pay of the cartels and continue to do so. Some examples of these issues is in, and this is about 10 years ago, 9 years ago, but you can pick out more recent examples. But in November 2008, it was called Operation Clean House, where the head of the Mexican police, Mexican Office of Interpol, which is the international policing organization, was under the pay of the Gulf Cartel, associate director of the federal police force, and then the assistant secretary of public security for Mexico was all under the pay and came under this operation. You can see the Noé Ramirez, who was the former director of the organized crime. CICIDO is the organized crime task force in Mexico, reportedly received $500,000 a month in order to turn a blind eye to drug cartel operations. So you can imagine that if somebody's getting $500,000 a month and is in charge of the corruption and organized crime prevention in Mexico, you can imagine how endemic this problem is. Some other examples, the generals and other military people have been under the pay of the cartels. The Mexican military has been used in Mexico more and more over the years in order to combat drugs. And it was the one agency or organization in Mexico that was thought to be free of corruption. But what we're seeing is because the military is being used more and more in combating the drug cartels, we're starting to see further corruption of the military in Mexico, which is certainly very concerning. Another example of this corruption is some of the soldiers that used to be part of special forces in Mexico broke off from the Gulf cartel to form another cartel known as the Los Zetas. And these Los Zetas is probably the most powerful drug cartel in Mexico now, and was formed by former soldiers and leaders of those soldiers. So we see then Mexican military becoming more corrupt and involved in the drug cartel and drug trafficking. We see mayors, 2010, the mayor of Cancun, which is part of the Gulf cartel area, detained, and then recent governors of Tamaulipas, which had ties to the Gulf cartel. I'll let Aaron go ahead and take the next couple of slides here regarding local police involvement, as well as some of the payoff and strategies that are used by the cartels in order to try to co-opt local police. So go ahead, take it away, Aaron. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and unmute Aaron here. I think I'm just going to have to unmute you, Aaron, so stand by here. Okay, Aaron, I unmuted you. Go ahead.
All right, sorry about that.
Yeah, no, that was my fault. Go ahead.
Okay. So as stated earlier, I mean, corruption's kind of a culture in Mexico right now, so it's not really a surprise that the local municipal police has become involved, but you'll see some reasons and some actually very high numbers and surprising numbers of statistics here. So in 2009, out of 357 Mexican law enforcement officials that were detained for their involvement, 90% of those belong to the local police forces. So a lot of the detainments happening are at the local level. And this helps to provide the social base for this organized crime down there at that local level. And 93.6% of those municipal police depend on the corruption to keep their salaries low, which helps perpetuate this cycle. Charles Bowden has a good quote here that in over half a century of fighting drugs in Mexico, there's never been a unit or task force created to combat the traffickers that didn't themselves end up joining the traffickers, which can help, again, perpetuate the military style cartels and trafficking and make it even harder to combat as they increase the skill set that they have by involving the local police and law enforcement. It can really help them with their corruption and continuing to skirt the laws in local areas. And then the payoffs and their strategies and who they target has been happening for, as you can see, a long time. From the 90s, over $500 million a year was spent just in bribes alone. And those bribes are designed to neutralize the state's enforcement of laws. So money is powerful and speaks volumes in those areas. And who they would target are those directly responsible for enforcing the efforts, including the military commandos or commanders, the judges, treasury and banking officials. So a lot of the high local areas leadership is who they're targeting with these bribes. And as mentioned earlier, they're giving some of the individuals are bribing $500,000 a month, which means these guys are making a lot more off these bribes than they could in their regular day-to-day jobs. So it can be an enticing way to get them to work for them. And then with those bribes, there's some responsibilities that are included, like entertaining guests and friends or turning a blind eye to their crimes or the merchandise and drug trafficking that they're involved in. And it also allows them to get information ahead of time on any possible raids that could be happening.
Yeah. Yeah, Aaron brings up some excellent points in these two slides. The average salary of a local policeman in Mexico is $300 a month. The range that I've seen is anywhere between $300 to $500 a month. So you can imagine if you have millions of dollars sloshing around in these local areas, you know, you choose, you know, as a local police official, what, you know, if you want to supplement your salary to turn a blind eye to the drug traffickers and make 7 to 8 times your monthly salary by joining the drug traffickers, or at least turning a blind eye, that's a good way to make money. But the other major thing is if you go against the cartels and you either report their activities to the federal police or try to prevent the drug cartels from operating in the area, you will be threatened with your life and oftentimes killed for what you for doing that. So you can imagine it's either take the bribe or take the bullet, and that is the bottom line at the local levels in Mexico. Is that you have many good law enforcement people at the local level that simply throw up their arms in frustration because they can't do their job, simply because they're people on the police force are taking bribes, or they want to preserve their own life, so they don't report the drug cartels. And so it is a very, very serious problem. I've done many cases where law enforcement officials from Mexico, local policemen, have had to flee Mexico to the United States because they were threatened by the cartels. And the arguments that I make in these hearings is that here is a police officer who's attempting to enforce the laws of both Mexico and what the United States wants them to do, but if they go back to Mexico, they will be killed. And so oftentimes that does resonate with the immigration justices and the judges in the United States. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes we send people back to Mexico, law enforcement officials back to Mexico, to be dealt with by the cartels. And so it's a very, very difficult and sad situation for as a local law enforcement official in Mexico. We talk a little bit more about some of the infiltration, just to continue to give you more of an idea of what these cartels are doing. I mean, what we're talking about here is really not just bribing of officials, but just actually putting drug cartel individuals and actually placing them in certain parts of the Mexican government itself. So we're talking about using drug cartel members to infiltrate the military, to become local mayors, local officials, federal police, and federal justices. So you can see here some examples of, a member of the Gulf cartel that was a former judicial police officer, former police officer that was part of the Juarez cartel, and then again, soldiers and other senior officials that actually infiltrate the state. We see this also. Aaron and I looked at this issue also with gangs in Central America. What you start seeing is the sophistication of gangs, and the gangs infiltrating local governments as well as military, shedding their tattoos and becoming more blended in with the local and the military and the government in order to be able to operate. So it's a very concerning thing here that these cartels are not just using bribes, but actually infiltrating the mechanisms of government themselves. All right. Okay, so what's the problem here then with prosecution and what we call impunity, which means what is the percentage of actually cases that actually then go to charges and then actually imprisonment. And you can see that in Mexico that only 10% of crimes are reported in Mexico due to the drug cartels, mainly because of fear, and then actually sentences 3% of all sentences in Mexico actually go to conviction of any sort of action that happens. This is state, federal, and local level in Mexico that results in a conviction. We might contrast this with the US federal government that looks at about a 96% conviction rate. So in the United States, you have about a 95 to 96% conviction rate. And then you just flip that 100% on top of it, where you see 96 to 97% rate of non-conviction in Mexico. So you can imagine that even if you do report somebody in Mexico for violating drugs or doing something illegal, the chances of them ever being punished are low. So why would you, as a police officer or as a local person, report somebody when you know that they're probably going to continue to stay in the streets and going to continue to operate, and oh, by the way, they're going to probably come after you. So you can see that just serious issues. This is all throughout Central America and Mexico. And again, you know, these are figures that are a little bit dated, but hold. All of these figures I'm quoting through 2009 and 10 still hold today. 5,000 deaths in 2009, 10, only 212 people found guilty. See more in 2001, El Chapo had an assisted escape. And then we see again here last year, El Chapo was a senior member of the of the Sinaloa Federation cartel, which is in the western part of Mexico. They control or partially control Baja California, Michoacan, and Tamaulipas states. He then escaped again from a maximum security prison and was in last year, and then was recaptured. So we see that that the senior people escaped from prison with help, what was called by Mexican officials as a quote assisted escape. 2010, inmates are escaped and are abetted by officials who are oftentimes corrupted by money or by threats. So they've done a survey in Mexico every year since I think the 1990s, and I think it's 20% of the Mexican population have confidence or high confidence in the ability of the Mexican police to fight crime. So you can see a very, very low percentage believe that Mexicans, organizations can do anything to stop this situation. All right, I talked to you about the long history of corruption and drug trafficking in Mexico. I think the important thing to get out of this slide is that for much of the history of what we call the Revolutionary Party of Mexico, that they really turned a blind eye to drug trafficking. Drug trafficking has been going on in Mexico throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. However, the government really just let it flourish and without really much interference or obstruction. However, as I'm going to show you in subsequent slides, the PRI and other parties in Mexico that after the 2000 election started enforcing the drug laws in Mexico, and then this created tension and violence between the government and the cartels, and we're seeing this violence continue here today in Mexico. Okay, so we talked about the PRI, just let them evolve discreetly, and basically it was a bargain between the PRI and the local and the drug traffickers. So it was what was known as turning a blind eye. However, what happened was a number of things that caused this transformation. In the 1980s, most of the drug trade from Colombia went through the Caribbean, through Miami. If you might remember the TV series in the 1980s, Miami Vice, a lot of the trafficking went through that area. Well, the U.S. got wise to that, set up a very, very strong net, the Coast Guard, with the Navy, with listening stations such as JADAF, Joint Interagency Task Force, Key West, that was able then to interdict drug trafficking going through the Caribbean and pretty much shut it off. So we're looking at, by the 1990s, you had the drug traffickers decided that they needed to move their drugs through Central America, through Mexico to the United States, and that the Caribbean avenue was cut off to them. So what that then created was the Mexican drug trafficking organizations grew in power and just became much more autonomous than in the past. So what you had was the Colombians who would drop their drugs off to the Mexican drug trafficking organizations. The Mexicans would pay off the Colombians and then control the drug trade into the United States. So you can imagine the amount of money that was sloshing around starting in the 1990s and into the 2000s when the drugs started going through Mexico rather than through the Caribbean. And so that just created more power, more violence with the drug traffickers because of the power that they had, the money that they had. Before Calderon came into power in 2006, again, there was a blind eye turned to the cartels themselves, although because of their increasing power, presidents before Calderon knew that there was a problem and that eventually would have to be dealt with. However, President Calderon from 2006 to 2012 became much more aggressive in his enforcement of the laws of Mexico and started cracking down on these DTOs. Okay, so what would be called President Calderon's war on the drug trafficking organization. So 2006 is a very important, late 2006 is a very, very important time to keep in mind in Mexico, because that was when Calderon started deploying the military into various states in Mexico, into attempting to stop the DTOs from operating. And what you see from 2006, which continues today, is just simply a skyrocketing of violence in Mexico, where killings from both, civilian killings from both the drug trafficking organizations and the military have increased greatly. Military doubled in size over the last 20 years. Military spending is increasing, and then extradition is increasing. But the violence in Mexico since 2006 has been very, very high and continues to be high, even though the crackdown by the military and the federal police has resulted in some fragmentation of the drug cartels. What we're looking at really today is even with this fragmentation, what we see is the same or increasing levels of violence between federal officials, military, and the drug traffickers as they continue to attempt to conduct operations, their drug trafficking operations. We have not seen any decrease in the amount of drugs going into the United States because of any of these operations, but we have seen a great uptick in violence. So the cartels are finding ways to continue to get drugs into the United States. Okay, some of the reforms that they've been doing, you can see is really when I'm asked by immigration judges and by by the ICE attorneys, or the immigration and naturalization immigration attorneys, what I'm asked is, okay, well, what's going on in Mexico, and is the Mexican government itself turning a blind eye? Because one of the things that is important in establishing asylum in the United States is that there's willful neglect by the Mexican government in controlling these drug traffickers. So my answer to them is that at the federal level, they are trying the best that they can in order to be able to stop these traffickers, because at the federal level, you can control the recruitment of both federal police and military. You can keep them walled off, keep them separated from the local level, from the cartels. and then you can deploy them in the various areas in order to be able to stop these cartels. So the federal level, Mexico has increased its ability to be able to deal with the drug trafficking organizations. The problem is, again, is at the local level, where the police at the local level and the government officials at the local level simply cannot be walled off from the cartels, cannot be walled off from the society in general, and then and are influenced and oftentimes under the pay of the cartels. So it's very similar to what we see in the United States with the FBI, with our active duty military, who are on these bases or in large federal compounds walled off. I deployed to Iraq 3 times, and during my time in the Army, and the dynamic is very similar. You have U.S. military forces who live on what we call forward operating bases, go into a local town, try to root out some of the insurgents that are in the area. However, when we return to our forward operating bases and we don't live with the people, the drug traffickers return, or in the case of Iraq, the insurgents return. So what you see is a similar dynamic here, where the military and the federal police cannot be at all places at all times, and thus, the cartels still control it at the local level. So that's really my response that I give to anybody who asks, or the judges that ask me, what the situation in Mexico is regarding the law enforcement and the cartels. Okay, so I talked a little bit about the backlash of violence that's taken place, the number of people killed only in the 5-year period between 6 and 11. Another, since 11 to 16, 60,000 people, more people have been killed. And you can see that, you see assassination of governmental candidates, infiltration, and things like that continue to happen in Mexico through today. So we'll go ahead and finish up here with the last couple of slides here. Basically, the situation has not changed too much. We see a fragmentation of the cartels themselves. We see the federal government in particular concentrating on taking down senior members of the Mexican drug cartels. El Chapo is one example. The Mexican state right now is particularly concentrating on a very on a growing cartel known as the new generation cartel of Jalisco. That is probably one of the fastest growing cartels in Mexico, and their leader is being sought at by the Mexican authorities. But again, what we found in Iraq and other places where we attempt to try to cut off the head of the leaders of these organizations, another person or someone, their deputy or some other person within the organization steps up to take over. So the federal government in Mexico has attempted to kind of cut off the head of these organizations, but it's just so difficult simply because they're complex organizations, and other people go ahead and rise to the top of the organization if one person is taken out. Okay, I talked about the level of violence, the kidnapping, human trafficking, protection, and extortion that these cartels do. One of the interesting things that the cartels are doing here recently is tapping into the fuel lines. There's or gas lines in Mexico. Mexico, unlike the U.S., has a state-controlled oil and gas company called Pemex, or Petroleum Mexico. Petroleum Mexico is a huge organization, but the drug cartels have actually tapped into these lines and are now selling fuel as well as drugs. So it's not just drugs, but fuel, kidnapping, extortion, and other areas that the cartels are involved in. Another very troubling piece here that I think you all should be aware of is the marrying up of the Central American gang situation with what's going on with the cartels. So in Mexico, so you have gangs such as the M18 or the MS-13 in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala that are actually being trained now by some of the militarized elements of the Mexican drug trafficking organizations, because the gangs help with bringing drugs from Central America to Mexico and then dropped off to Mexico to the United States. So what we see is then a spreading of this violence, not just, or the spreading of this criminal organization and rackets, not just in Mexico, but through Central America, and has created just really an environment of lawlessness in all of the countries of Central America and Mexico. What's the conclusion here? What we have is that really trafficking cannot take place without a rule, what we would call a rule of law deficit, or the corruption. The state lacks that capacity to minimize, to eliminate. They have succeeded in fragmenting the cartels, but not necessarily eliminating these criminal organizations. Calderon's war has backlashed into violence. His successor in 2012, who's getting ready to leave in 2018, Enrique Peña Nieto has kept Calderon's policies pretty much in place, although he has somewhat tramped down the violence and hasn't deployed the military as strongly as Calderon has. But again, he continues pretty much the same policies as Calderon, and it looks as though that the candidates running in the Mexican election upcoming are going to continue these policies. There's not a candidate, there's one candidate who is expressed kind of some issues with the way that this is being conducted, the counter drug operations, but for the most part, the public as well as the candidates are supportive of this policy to try to eliminate these cartels, even though it has increased in violence in Mexico. So, you know, it's rather depressing situation in Mexico. And, you know, of course, it's, you know, if you want to trace it back to, you know, the main issue is the money that's involved here, the drug demand in the United States, and that people in places like Mexico, Central America, who don't make a lot of money will go to any length in order to make money, and in order to have the drugs come to the United States. And so, so the United States, along with Mexico, continues to work to decrease the violence, to try to stop the drugs from coming to the United States. But the results have been rather depressing and rather ineffectual. Go ahead, if you have any questions for Aaron and I, we're more than happy to go ahead and answer any of them for you right now. So please. Go ahead.
All right, can you hear me?
Who's this?
This is Dylan.
Yeah, Dylan. Hey, Dylan, give us your background a little bit, and you know, what you're doing at Global, and you know, how you're liking the program so far that you're in, if you're a student, and then we'll happy to answer a question you might have.
I am a student. I'm in the graduate program for the criminal justice and law enforcement administration. I am currently a probation officer for the state of Colorado. I am up in Boulder. I was down in Denver for a while, and then just recently transferred up to Boulder. But yeah, things are going so good so far. I'm actually pretty early on in my graduate program, but I got my bachelor's degree in criminology back in 2014 from Missouri State University before moving out here.
Well, great. Thanks for your service in law enforcement, and I'm sure the master's program at Global is really just kind of rounding out some of the things in criminal justice.
I guess my question was based on kind of that last piece as far as like the response to it. I don't remember the exact wording on the last slide, but it was about, you know, reducing violence is really is really the key here, instead of targeting these drug operations, or these organizations, excuse me. I guess, could you just dive a little deeper into that? Like what?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess, you know, if you take a look at, you know, we're talking about I alluded to it earlier, the Revolutionary Party of Mexico, that really what they did was they turned a blind eye to, they basically let the drug cartels operate without any interference from the government. And so, you know, I think, you know, in order to tramp down the violence, you know, you just turn a blind eye to the you know, their operations in the country, because really what's caused the violence is the military, you know, and the federal police confronting these drug trafficking organizations. So, so what do? If you don't enforce the Mexican law, then, you know, that now you've got, you know, unimpeded drugs coming into the United States, and the issue is going to be is that the price of the drugs are going to go down if you have unimpeded, because what it's done is it's raised the price of the drugs. So when you do an operations against the drug traffickers, it makes it more expensive for them to sell their drugs in the United States if you have an increase in price. And then when you have an increase in price, less people can buy them, you know, in the U.S. So it's always been that kind of conundrum. Well, what do? You know, we're not talking about, of course, marijuana, because marijuana, of course, is you know, is legal in Colorado now. But we're talking about like cocaine and other those type drugs that will never be legalized. But it's just a difficult situation because, you know, what do? Do you just turn a blind eye and let them operate? You know, because the violence was due to you know, the Mexican military and police actually enforcing Mexican law. You know, I mean, it's a real tough situation. I mean, it's and believe me, the U.S. is not, you know, anytime that the U.S. has been involved in kind of this, they have continued to encourage the enforcement of Mexican law. You know, and that's really what they were pushing the Mexican government to do, is just to enforce their laws. But you see the fallout from it is just increasing violence. The Mexican military and U.S. military really don't have a great relationship with each other. The Navy has a pretty good relationship with the U.S. Navy, but, you know, I was a graduate of the U.S. Army School of the Americas at Fort Benning, and we had a Mexican officer down there that they just kind of don't like to cooperate with the U.S. too much. There's just too much history between the two countries to really have the kind of cooperation that, like, say, we have with Honduras, or we have with, you know, with other, you know, Honduras is one example, Guatemala being another, where we have a much better relationship with. There's just kind of always been a kind of a touchy relationship between our two countries, and it inhibits somewhat our ability to be able to, you know, work together. I know it probably didn't answer, Dylan. You know what the tough thing about this is, I'm not sure if I have an answer to your question.
Well, it was kind of a loaded question anyway. I mean, I'm sure we would have a lot of people asking us that. But it is tough.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Aaron, was there anything that I said on my portion of the talk that you might want to, based on you know, kind of the work that we've done with gangs and anything else that may have come to your mind that when I was talking that you might want to just elaborate on, or something like that? I don't know. Is there anything?
Well, if we involve it in our work with the gangs, you had mentioned how in Central America, a lot of them are trying to assimilate into like local government or military and law enforcement by kind of going away from the tattoos and things like that. There's also the issue that I'm not sure if the cartels are doing this in Mexico, but I know like down in El Salvador, a lot of the prisons are being essentially run by these gangs. They're so powerful. So there's that side of it as well. When there's the few cases where there is punishment, there's a possibility that the cartels are so far into the prison system, and that was apparent with the El Chapo escapes, that there's possibly, it's not even a you know, a deterrent to go to prison because it's so ingrained, the corruption in the area.
Right. Yeah, I know we looked at, some of the reforms, and that's certainly one of the reforms they're trying in El Salvador is attempting to infiltrate the government is trying to, reform their efforts in prisons and trying to, take control of the prisons back from the gangs. So that's one thing that I know that you and I both looked at with our article that we looked at. One of the things that is really troubling to me is, particularly in Guatemala, you have in southern Mexico and northern Guatemala, there's these very hilly, rugged terrain areas down in Chiapas and areas, particularly in northern Guatemala, where you have M18 and M13 actually training with Los Zetas in camps in order to teach the gangs military style tactics that were learned by the Los Zetas when they were in the Mexican military. So that's a very, very troubling thing that's happened in the last probably 3 to 4 years that indicates that that the gangs are becoming increasingly sophisticated, and in fact may be weaponized and may be actually more powerful than the Guatemalan military. So you can imagine now, the marrying up of these two, forces together as they traffic drugs to the U.S. and these local, these countries not being able to control the gangs in their area. And this really all stems in Central America. And Aaron and I looked at this with really the civil wars that took place in Central America in the 1980s, included in the early 1990s. It created a real deficit in governmental authority. A lot of guerrillas that were joined the gangs. And so you have, particularly in Central America, very, very weak government structure, and it makes the Mexican government look powerful compared to some of the problems that the Central American governments are facing. So it's a very, very troubling situation in these countries. Last couple of days in El Paso, they had I don't know if anybody caught this, but they had a DEA agent who was kidnapped probably by a member of the Gulf Cartel, was taken across the border in Mexico, had his fingers cut off, was left for dead on the side of the road, and back in El Paso. And so this is one of the first instances recently that we're aware of that a DEA agent actually has been killed, or been not killed, but has been threatened and has been mutilated by these cartels. And so it's created an alarm in U.S. law enforcement over the last few days. Is anybody aware of that issue that in the last few days? Has anybody gotten that through their agencies? No. Okay. Well, yeah. Check it out. I'll I'll send you, Dylan and Eric. I'll send you that video on that, just so and I'll send that to you, Aaron, also, so you can kind of see what's going on with that. And the other two people on the line, if you want to see that video too, where it's analyzing this DEA agent who got kidnapped and mutilated, let me know, and and you can email me at robert.kirkland@csuglobal.edu, and I'll be more than happy to send you that video. Okay. Okay, great. Okay, well, everybody, thanks so much for attending today. We really very, very much appreciate it, and we hope that you enjoyed it. Both Aaron and I are, of course, available by email. I think would be aaron.appelwick@csuglobal.edu if you have any questions of Aaron. And we got a new 2018 edition of our book, Drug Cartel and Gang Violence in Mexico and Central America. So please check that out. It'll be on Amazon. And we very much appreciate you coming today. So thanks a lot, everyone.